Hi, I'm Mark David Gerson. Welcome to Stories and Reflections, where my stories are also yours. There are three stories of how I came to be: the conventional one, the one close friends and family were told, and the truth. That's how I start the first chapter of my Acts of Surrender memoir, and I can't think of a better way to start this episode. I titled that chapter An Inconvenient Truth, and it was a riff on the 2006 documentary about Al Gore's campaign to educate people about global warming. But my chapter had nothing to do with climate change, except maybe for the kind of microclimate change that takes place inside families. Thing is, the truth of how I came to be was inconvenient. So inconvenient that I knew nothing about it until my late 20s, after all the principal players in my family drama had passed away. Well, all but me, of course. So those three stories. The easy one is the conventional one, and that's that I'm the natural son of Edith and Sidney Gerson, conceived and born in Montreal in the mid-1950s. That's the assumption we all make, that we're the natural kids of the father and mother we know as our parents, at least until we're told otherwise. I was told otherwise. So picture this, as Sophia might have said in The Golden Girls. Toronto, 1984. A quiet residential street in the largely Jewish northern suburb of North York. It's a warm July day, and I've trekked up here with a cassette recorder. Remember cassette recorders? I've trekked up here with a cassette recorder to visit Sophie Katz, my mother's oldest friend. They've known each other for more than 50 years, since meeting in the schoolyard at King Edward VII Elementary in Montreal. But that's a different story. This story begins a few months after my mother's death. When I call Sophie, we're both living in Toronto, and I ask her if I can come up to see her. I'm hoping she'll have some stories to share about my mother. I know hardly anything about my mother's past. You see, my mother never talked about the past, not ever. And that's why I encourage people to write about their past. Even if those writings never end up in a published memoir, those stories and memories will be a legacy cherished by kids and grandkids, and by their kids and their grandkids. Of course, we don't want to dwell on the past, we don't want to get stuck there. We don't want to get stuck in some sort of false nostalgia for other times that only seem better through the lens of time. Still, knowing where we came from and understanding the dynamics that got us here can not only explain a lot about our present, but can guide us as we move into the future. Either guide us with inspiration or guide us with cautionary tales to help prevent us from repeating generational patterns. And memoir is also healing for the writer. I should know, I've written 3 memoirs and I have 3 more in the works. But back to my story. So Sophie and I settle into her den. She's lying down on the sofa. I'm sitting in an armchair opposite. And I've set up my tape recorder on the coffee table between us. The mic, of course, facing Sophie. And as I tell you this story more than 40 years later, it's hard for my brain to wrap itself around the fact that Sophie was probably about 10 years younger than I am right now when we met in her house on that summer afternoon. And at the time, she seemed so much older than my 29-year-old self. And now I'm older than she was. I'm older than both my parents were when they died, in fact. Anyhow, Sophie told me story after story after story about their growing up years in Montreal. It was amazing. But you know what? It also saddened me. Why did I have to wait until my mother died to hear these stories? Why couldn't she have shared them with me and my sister while she was still alive? Maybe not the hard stories, but the fun stories. There've got to have been some fun stories, even some of them. Like maybe this one, which was my favorite story from this part of the visit because it revealed a side of my mother I had never witnessed or even suspected. So it was the mid-1930s, at the height of the Depression. My mother, Edith, and her best friend, Sophie, they were strolling down St. Lawrence Boulevard one day. and St. Lawrence Boulevard at the time was Jewish Montreal's main street back then. And as they were strolling down the street, a vagrant sitting on the curb grabbed my mother's ankle. She shook her leg free and they continued on. But after half a block, my mother stopped, spun around, and marched back. Glaring at the vagrant, she kicked him hard and then returned to Sophie. It's that same combination of pluck and determination that kind of explains the inconvenient truth of my origins, though perhaps not the secrecy surrounding them. Anyways, we're getting to those origins. In fact, we've gotten to those origins. We're there now. So after a few more stories like that, Sophie half sat up. Do you want to know everything? She asked. Well, I nodded. Why wouldn't I? Sophie paused. Sydney, she declared, wasn't your father. Sydney wasn't my father? Sydney wasn't my father. On one hand, that was a big deal, a huge deal. How could it not be? My father wasn't my father. On the other hand, Sydney, who hadn't been my father, had been barely present in my life. At least that's how it had felt, how it had always felt. On the surface, he had been severely diabetic and in and out of hospitals for years, until he ended up in a chronic care facility, which is where he died a few months before my 14th birthday. But were there other reasons why it sensed not only a physical absence, but also an emotional one? Well, maybe. And that brings me to the second story of how I came to be, the one that family and close friends were told. And that story was artificial insemination. Now, that isn't as crazy as it sounds, because artificial insemination was around in the mid-50s. I looked it up. Yes, it was still somewhat experimental, but it was being done. So why artificial insemination? Well, there's a good chance that my father's diabetes had rendered him impotent, which means he knew I wasn't his natural son, which could also explain the emotional distance that I felt. And it could also explain why my older sister had been adopted 4 years earlier. Even if he wasn't impotent, there could have been another reason for artificial insemination. And here's that reason. I'd had an older brother who was born in 1942 with Down syndrome. Well, they didn't call it Down syndrome then, but that's what it was, and who died 10 years later. My parents could have felt that it was too risky to try again, so my sister was adopted. And well, that brings me to the third story of how I came to be. The truth that was too inconvenient for anyone to ever talk about. A truth that probably only Sophie ever knew. For this story, we have to travel even farther back in time. We have to go back to World War II. We have to go to Ottawa. Sophie and her husband Morris were living there during the war. So were my parents. And so was a young refugee couple, George and Helena Weor, who had fled Europe, barely escaping the Nazi onslaught. All of George's family, still in Poland, would perish in the Holocaust. But George had been studying medicine in France, so he and Helena had managed to get from France to Spain, and then to Canada, to Ottawa. As Sophie told it, she and Morris introduced my parents to George and Helena, and, well, not to put too fine a point on it, my mother and George had an affair. That was shocking enough to hear all those years later. We don't think of our parents as sexual beings, at least we try not to. But what Sophie shared next was even more astounding. Of course, I wasn't conceived in Ottawa during my mother's affair with George back then. I'm not that old. And I don't know any other details about the affair, or how or when it started, or how or when it ended. Here's what I do know, again, from what Sophie told me. When the war ended, my parents were back in Montreal, and George was in Western Canada continuing his medical studies. His wife, Helena, they never divorced, had returned to Poland. Then, in 1950, my sister was adopted. In 1952, my brother Michael died. And sometime in the next few years, my mother determined that she wanted another child. Not another adoption, another natural child. And one way or another, For one reason or another, that child's father was not going to be Sidney Gerson, could not be Sidney Gerson. Now, the next part of the story is a bit fuzzy, but here's the bottom line from what Sophie told me. My mother and George meet secretly in Winnipeg in early 1954, and I'm conceived. Artificial insemination? No idea. Either way, though, George Weor was the father. My father. And not for the first time in my life, and certainly not for the last, I discovered that I wasn't who I thought I was. Anyhow, that's what my mother told Sophie, and that's what Sophie told me. Why did Sophie tell me? When I share this story, people ask me this all the time. First, based on the way she told the story, I don't think Sophie was ever really all that keen on my father, on my Gerson father, on Sidney. Certainly that's the impression I get. But her stated reason was practical, very practical. Sidney had been seriously ill and had died young. Two of his siblings had died in their teens. As Sophie put it, there was a lot of sickness in that family. I didn't want you to think you carried any of those genes, she said. I wanted to free you from worrying about that. The story could have ended there, but it didn't. It gets crazier, sort of. How can this get crazier? Well, how about this? Growing up, I knew George Weor, though of course I never knew he was my biological father. He, of course, must have known that I was his son. You see, within a few years of that Winnipeg meetup, George moved back to Montreal and opened a medical practice as an ophthalmologist. And a few years after I was born, when it was discovered that I couldn't see the blackboard in school, I was sent to an eye doctor. I was sent to George Weor. George remained my eye doctor until I was in my teens. My mother even worked for him briefly, though I can't remember if it was just before or just after my father died. Not only was he my eye doctor, not only was he my mother's employer for a short time, when I was little, I remember him as being a close family friend. He came to Passover Seder's at our house. I have a strange memory of him bringing us a box of Swiss chocolates at one of those Seders. And when he traveled, which I remember him doing often, George always brought gifts back for me and my sister. I even remember a huge sombrero he brought Susan, my sister, from Mexico, and a vase he brought me back from Greece that showed some mythological scene. But never, ever, ever through all that time, or any of the time that followed, was there any hint from him, from my mother, of who he really was to me. Well, maybe there was one hint. So now it's 1979. It's a muggy August morning in Montreal, and in one of life's weird synchronicities and ironies, it's a day before the 11th anniversary of Sidney's death, of my Gerson father's death. I'm working at my desk in the public relations office at Concordia University, and my mother calls. And there's nothing unusual about that, but we have a good relationship, and we generally speak several times a week. But what is unusual is the conversation. And perhaps what's even more unusual is what's left unsaid. George died, my mother says, a car accident yesterday. Of course, I'm sorry to hear that George is gone, but it's been years since I've seen him, probably since my last eye appointment with him in my teens. And even then, I had no reason to feel close to him. He was my eye doctor. And years before, probably 20 years before, he'd been a family friend. That's all. Still, something feels off about that phone call, even if I can't touch what it is. Then 5 years later, when Sophie reveals the inconvenient truth about my paternity, I remember that conversation. And it strikes me that maybe my mother was trying to communicate something to me, something she couldn't put into words, something she didn't dare put into words. Family secrets. All families have them. Michael's existence was also one. My mother never, ever mentioned him. It was my sister who told me about him. And she only found out about him by accident. And even then, my mother said nothing. By the way, if you've read any of my Sarah Stories novels, especially the first one, Sarah's Year, you might recognize certain aspects of this story in that one. My mother is a version of the Esther character. Sophie is a version of the Sarah character. Even Michael has a counterpart. In that story, he's Sarah's son. And me? Well, I'm there too, really highly fictionalized as Bernie. And George? George is in there too, but you'll have to read the books, or at least the first one, to find out how. One day I'll tell you the story about Sarah's Year, how it came to be written, and all the really wacky synchronicities around it. But that's a story for another day. Let's get back to these stories and to stories. If you've got kids and grandkids, tell them your stories. If they're not ready to hear them, and even if they are, write them down. Because if they're not ready to hear them today, one day they will be. One day they will want to hear about your life, and you may already be gone. As I put it in From Memory to Memoir, my book on memoir writing, what you have lived is unique. What you have learned through your years of living is beyond price. And the value of all you shared through your words and of all the ways you awaken and grow through your words is incalculable. It's true for me. It's true for you. It's true for everyone. So don't just listen to my stories. Tell yours. Tell them now. Record them. Write them. Get them out. Get them down. Your family will thank you, even if you're no longer alive when they get around to it. More than that, though, today, now, it will be powerful for you. Our stories always are. Here's how I put it in Acts of Surrender, a writer's memoir, my first memoir. Every day's writing about the past has brought with it more revelations about the present. And every day's surrender to these pages reminds me that what I'm writing about is now, not then. So once again, tell your stories. Tell the stories of your life. Don't let them get lost. They are so valuable. Thanks for joining me for Stories and Reflections today. I hope you found moments in my stories that touched something in yours. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And for more of my stories and help telling yours, check out my books at markdavidgerson.com or from online booksellers worldwide. Until next time, don't forget that you're a storyteller too, and keep telling your stories. The intro and outro music for today's episode is Heartwarming by Kevin MacLeod from Incompetech.com, licensed under Creative Commons.